Thank you. Whoops. Are we on? Are we on? Oh, yes. Okay. Uh, welcome. We haven't had a Division Two meeting in how long, Mickey? 6 months? Yeah. This is quite exciting. Um, I was hoping that Representative Rawlings would be here this morning. Um, Maybe he's afraid of us or something. I don't know. We're such wonderful people. I can't believe that. Anyhow, he did provide an amendment that Representative Lynn has sent out, and this replaces the what we heard last week, whenever that was. So this is a replacement amendment to HB 1300. So if you, I hope, I think I had sent this to everyone ahead of time, but it's, anyhow. Yes.
I have a question.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
don't, yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I don't know if I was supposed to keep my hold
No,
on to
you're
this.
not. You need to pull it closer, Tom. There you go. No, push the red button. There you go. Then pick your finger up. You should be okay.
Okay. So, if I remember correctly, that the last time we met on this bill, we wanted if there was any funds left over, we wanted them to go back into the general fund.
No.
What I see on this
Yeah,
amendment is it just goes back to DES.
Yeah, that was not this bill. That
Okay.
was,
Well, that's still my question about the amendment. It seems like it just goes in circles here. It's just, if they don't use all the money, it goes back to DES. It doesn't go back to general funds. It should go to the general funds, shouldn't it?
yeah,
Anyway, that was my question.
okay, okay.
Thank you.
Mickey, you said someone was here from DES?
Yeah, we have Sarah Kern from the department here, possibly to answer questions. I think they just saw this amendment this morning, earlier today, for the first time.
Oh, okay.
But
Okay.
she is here to answer questions.
All right. Sarah, why don't you come up? I'm sorry you're so far away. This is this is not the norm for Division Two or your previous division, Division One. But let me just say we're happy to have you, and it'll be our goal to get to know the people in DES, and we thank you for being with us this morning.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I ask?
Okay. Did you want to say anything, or do you?
Well, I know that Director Wimsatt testified at the hearing. I'm Director Wimsatt's assistant director, Sarah Juhas Kern, but you can just call me Sarah Kern because that's much easier.
I'm sorry, can I get you, what's the last name again?
Legally, Juhas, Y-U-H-A-S space Kern, K-I-R-N as in Nancy. But I'm happy with just Kern.
Thank you. Thank you.
I would, as you know, the department is not taking a position on this bill, so I'm just hoping I can answer any questions that you may have.
You had a question?
I did. And I know that what I'm going to be asking you in some regard a repeat of, or at least close to what I had asked at the other hearing, but I'm still not quite sure I understand. Could you just take us through typically what happens when a landfill closes down? In other words, I understand that there's this requirement that the owner provide these financial assurances, that kind of thing. But can you just kind of run us through that? In other words, suppose that a landfill is owned by some county or local level of government, and then it's going to close down.
Sure. At the time that the permittee applied to be able to build the landfill, they submitted a closure plan that was approved by DES. So when they close down, they follow the steps that they have outlined in their closure plan. And those can include things like putting the final cap on the landfill. And then they follow steps to maintain the closed landfill. It includes mowing the top of the landfill. If the landfill generates leachate, like the ash landfill, then that leachate needs to be collected and disposed of, and the collection system needs maintenance and checking. Landfills generate hazardous gases, landfill gas, so there are systems at the landfills that control the migration of those gases, so those systems need to be monitored and maintained. We need to make sure that gas isn't migrating anywhere that it could pose a risk. There typically are groundwater monitoring wells to check whether the breakdown of materials in the landfill are contaminating the groundwater and could pose a risk to drinking water. So there's a schedule by which the permittee needs to have those wells sampled. And the financial assurance that they demonstrate is to demonstrate that if they were to become insolvent, there's at least 30 years of money available that the state could access to pay for the continued maintenance and monitoring of the landfill.
Okay, so may I ask a follow-up? So can I just add, so again, let's assume that the landfill we're talking about is owned by some level of government, a county or a municipality or whatever. So when you say they have to provide some financial assurance, I mean, what is that? In other words, do they have to like post a bond or?
Thank you for that clarifying question. Okay. Because if the landfill is owned by a government entity, they have the option of doing the local government financial test to demonstrate that their entity has the money moving forward in the future. And then that satisfies their financial assurance. So a public entity would not have to get put in place the instruments that a private entity would. Those instruments for a private entity could be a surety bond, an insurance policy, a trust fund, an irrevocable letter of credit. I think the rules reference or other mechanisms. I asked our staff, what other mechanisms do we see? And they told me on rare occasion, a certificate of deposit.
Okay. Can I ask one other follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
So let me turn it, suppose that, I mean, I take it that with regard to a municipality or some level of government, the assurance basically would be the level of government's taxing authority. We can, if we don't, if something goes wrong here and we have to pay, we're going to tax the inhabitants to pay for the, I mean, is that basically correct?
While that makes sense to me, I have never been the one to review a local government financial test, so I would really want to check with our finance person to be sure, but that is logical.
All right, can I ask one other follow-up?
Oh, yes,
Just-
that's fine.
Just one of the, so let me switch gears for a minute. Suppose that this is a privately owned landfill, and suppose that, you know, it's in financial difficulty. In other words, suppose the owners say, yeah, I understand that the plan is we have to have a bond. We don't have the money. We can't, we're going to go bankrupt, or we don't have the money. What does DES do then? If they, in other words, suppose they investigate and they find out, yeah, they really don't have the money. What do you do then?
Well, the permittee was to demonstrate upfront before they got their permit that they had the money. This econ situation is a very unique situation. So econ is the only one that I'm aware of where they had the sufficient money in the beginning and they no longer do.
Okay, all right.
The rules and statutes, of course, give us authorities to enforce the rules and statutes. But of course, we'd rather find a better workable solution.
So.
Thank you very much, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Are there, yes, please, go ahead. Katie.
Thank you. Can you clarify, because when you were speaking here, you used the phrase 30 years, that they have to have money for 30 years. And if I can remember correctly from the hearing before, these people believed they had 30 years, they planned out for 30 years. And then somewhere along the way, the phrase, a rolling.
Yes.
So when you said 30 years, did you mean 30 years? Because that seems to be what they understood, and that's what they did. But now we hear that there's a rolling 30 years, which is basically 30 years in perpetuity. So can you clarify that for me?
Sure, that's a great question. The rules that are currently in effect require a rolling 30 years. And the reason for that is because a landfill does not suddenly have no risks after 30 years. The risks continue, although it's possible that the cost of managing them decreases over time. The rules were clarified in 2014 because there was confusion on many parts about whether that was a fixed 30 years or a rolling 30 years. Our position is that it has always meant a rolling 30 years, but it's clear that there was a lack of clarity on both sides at the time that this permittee took ownership of the landfill.
If I understand correctly, they followed the rules that were in effect in, what was it, 2011? When they asked for the permit, or they identified what they needed to do to close the landfill. And then, and so they put aside that money, you know, and then later on, when you clarified the rules, you changed the DES, not you, DES says your landfill closure plan is no longer good enough. You need an additional X amount of money to take care of 30 more years. Am I reading this correctly, or? I know you said your initial rules, you thought that that's what it was.
Well, this is one of the difficult parts of this situation. Our position is that even in 2011, even 2009, that the rules always meant a rolling 30 years, but they didn't state it clearly enough. If you, as Econ points out, if you look back at the information in their files and ours, it appears that there was a lack of clarity on the DES side as well as on the Econ side.
Please, let's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, Representative Heath, go ahead.
So my understanding is that this entity is a private entity. It does not have the capacity or taxing authority. So right now, the current situation is that they use some of these funds to maintain this landfill. And now they're in a situation where they're all volunteers and they're stuck. So does this amendment mean that $500,000 would be put in a fund at DES for this purpose? Now, one more question, unrelated to the amendment, is wonder if this landfill fails and DES has to take it over. So one way or another, this is kind of a conundrum. And why do we have to fix it? Is my question, I guess.
Thank you.
I don't have an answer.
So your first question about where would the money go if it was appropriated? Econ does have a financial assurance mechanism. It just doesn't have enough money in it. So my understanding of the bill is that The money would come to DES, and we would immediately cut a check to Econ's trust fund, which is held at Citizens Bank right now. They can always move that around if they want to with our approval. So that's where the money would go. On your second question, what happens if Econ dissolves and the landfill fails, or even what happens for the maintenance if Econ dissolves? At that point, we would, what we could say, call financial assurance and start using the trust fund, whatever money is in it, to pay for whatever needed to be done for the period of time that it lasted. And eventually it would run out, and the DES does not have funds dedicated to maintaining and monitoring landfills, but it would need to be maintained and monitored. So DES would look to the governor and the legislature for where that money would need to come from.
Thank you.
Can I ask? Oh, no, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go, Leslie.
Representative Turcott.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for testifying. I have a series of questions, if you don't mind. First question, is it the department's position that the rule was not changed but clarified in 2014? Just yes or no?
That is our position, yes.
Thank you. Okay. Next question. Can I continue?
Oh, yes.
Madam Chair, thank
Yeah,
you.
please.
Instead of asking every
This
time.
is a work session, so, you know.
I'm just learning about this, and my first introduction was an article I pulled from September of last year on this, so I'm using that as kind of a base. Currently, how much money is in the trust fund or whatever they're calling it right now? Do you know?
I
it
have
a-
notes on what was last reported to us.
Somewhere around 800,000, is that correct?
I believe that is correct. Yes,
Approximately.
883,000, yeah.
Oh, 883?
Mhm.
And the reason we are here is that the number that is supposed to be maintained on a rolling 30-year basis is 992. Is that correct?
The 992 number is not one that I entered into my notes,
Okay.
but this is an important question. The amount that needs to be maintained on the 30-year rolling basis is calculated in the post-closure cost estimate that the permittee is required to update every 3 years. And that closure cost estimate is to be for a 30-year period. We have not received a post-closure cost estimate for this landfill since 2016, and it was for 15 years, not for 30. So we really can't comment on what the total amount needed is at this point in time. We've been in close communication with Econ, and I am aware from just yesterday's communication that they've had an engineer working on a 30-year post-closure estimate, and it should be ready right around now, and they're interested in talking with DES about it, and we'll definitely make ourselves available. But at this point, we don't have the number that's necessary.
You don't have a current one. What was the number associated with the last estimate?
The last estimate, which was for only a 15-year period, was $688,989.
So that, excuse me, that was from 2016 to 2031. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
And
What-
final
what was that
question,
number again?
so it is the department's position that once you get this new estimate, that's the total amount of funds that should be in this rolling 30-year number as of now? Is that correct?
It's a little more nuanced than that.
Okay.
Once we get that updated estimate, we need to review it, And maybe the changes to it will just be tweaking the numbers because the cost of mowing has changed over the past 5 years. But perhaps, and what happens sometimes, perhaps they will propose to change some of the activities they're doing for post-closure maintenance. In that case, if it's a change to the post-closure activities, that's going to need a more thorough review by our engineers, and we'll need to go carefully through what they propose to do and through what the calculations are, and eventually we would ask for changes or approve it based on what we see. It's too soon to know. We don't know what it'll contain.
I lied. That wasn't my final question. You just gave me a
That's
new one.
okay.
So when you get and you redo your estimates and the department makes their calculations or whatever, the current amount in the, we just talked about somewhere around 883 or whatever the number is. Conceivably, the department's number could come in beneath that number?
It's really hard to know because I
It
don't
could-
know.
Let me rephrase it. It could come in below or above that number.
That's what I would say, yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Representative Petrie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, I got a couple of these beauties next to me. The Cardinal landfill, which I'm sure you know nothing about. But they have a trust to take care of it, and you know, that's like a blind trust. And they take care of theirs. Are they required to have the same thing? And right next door to that one is the town landfill. And we maintain a capital reserve fund, and when funds are needed, we take it out of that. So I'm surprised that this entity has it by itself, because it seems so the town of Newport should have the responsibility, because they probably put the refuse there. Is that correct?
This landfill actually accepted ash that came from municipal solid waste from a number of different communities in New Hampshire and Vermont. And at first, the permittee for the landfill was the coalition of those communities. But back in the early 2000s, Econ took the landfill over.
Uh-huh. Now, if Econ fails, all right, it sounds like you have insurance within DES of the bond. Well, I assume it's a bond. Now, wouldn't the city of Newport, they would inherit the land, so to speak, and wouldn't they be responsible to take care of it?
We're getting into some legal questions, and I'm a geologist, not an attorney. So I don't think I can comment on that.
Thank you.
Representative Lynn, you've been very patient.
I'm sorry, no, you know what, I'm just trying to follow this through. If, as I think I asked the last time we had it, if I understand correctly, there's no precedent for this and for what is being asked for here, in the sense that no other landfill has said, we misinterpreted what the regulation meant as to 30 years rolling versus 30 years fixed. Is that correct?
I don't think I can say for sure what all the other landfills have said, but we're not aware of any other landfill that finds themselves in this situation.
May I ask one other?
Yes, you may.
follow-up? So the thing I guess I'm trying to sort of envision what kind of precedent this would set. In other words, suppose that the situation was you have a landfill that, you know, got, they gave you the appropriate assurances for 30 years rolling, and it was, you know, X number of dollars. And then because of inflation or whatever, the costs of doing the maintenance went way up. Would that mean that it would be okay for that landfill to come to the legislature and say, we want an appropriation to bail us out? I would think that might happen. If that was a basis, that might happen with some regularity.
Well, DES is not taking a position on this bill and whether it's something we should do. But what I can offer is that there are more than 400 closed landfills in the state. Most of them are owned by local entities. We estimate there are about 50 that are owned by private entities. And from what we can tell, Econ may be the only nonprofit that owns a closed landfill in the state.
Yes, Representative Bucco.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you, Sarah. So my question is, how did this organization fund this trust originally? And if
Tom, let's save that question for Mr. Pinkham.
Well, my question is, if they depleted what they had, did they go to their own stakeholders first?
I
Or
think-
did they just come to the state?
I think that's a question that the
'Cause-
nonprofit needs to answer, and will.
And by the way, in the last time we met on this, I never heard these numbers that are being thrown around, like the $883,000 balance that's still in there. We never heard that.
That's true. Yes, Representative Murray.
Thank you. It seems like, the 883,000 seems like rather a lot of money. And I guess I have two questions related to that. If I'm misremembering, let me know. It seemed to me I have the understanding that because this kerfuffle arose, that DES was not releasing money for the landfill to continue to do its work. And first of all, can you clarify that? The second thing is, that's a lot of money to hold when it seems like the landfill is not asking for a lot of money in order to do its yearly job. And that because, regardless of where the problem was, DES is a professional group, Econ, I guess is their name, of more of the volunteers, and it seems it's incumbent upon DES to help out here and be a little creative and flexible in finding a solution so that Econ can do what it is that they apparently are trying very hard to do.
Your first question touches on a concept that can be confusing. The financial assurance mechanism, the trust fund, is not intended to be a debit account that pays for the maintenance. It's intended to sit undisturbed, to be there in the event that the permittee becomes insolvent. However, if a mechanism like a trust fund has more money than is necessary to cover the estimate for post-closure maintenance and monitoring, then the permittee can request for disbursements from the trust fund. That's what had been happening leading up to 2016, that DES was authorizing disbursements from the trust fund to help out with the maintenance and monitoring. Also a very unique situation. Then it was in 2016 when the situation of there not being enough money in the trust fund arose. And at that point in time, we weren't able to authorize any additional disbursements. As far as your second question, the DES is the entity that permits these landfills. We don't have funds to maintain and monitor landfills. We operate under the statutes and rules that are in existence, and we can do what's allowed in the statutes and rules. And we've been working really hard in close communication with Econ to try to find options under the statutes and rules, but we are limited by those regulations.
Representative Petrie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. Is there any place in the law to waiver some of these fees or this trust? What we're trying to do here.
To waive the requirement for financial assurance.
Right, well, it seems so there's some ambiguity as to what was interpreted, and, you know, that's gonna be a battle in itself.
DES, the rules that DES operates under usually include waiver provisions, and the provisions usually say that there needs to be an equivalent option presented. So if we could find that, that may be something that could be looked into.
Thank you.
Are there any further questions for DES? Okay, Sarah, don't go too far.
No problem. Very nice to meet you all.
Yes, nice meeting you. I probably should have introduced everyone to you, but,
That's okay. I can see.
okay. Would you mind coming up, Mr. Pinkin? It's Pinkin.
Pitkin.
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 Okay. All right. Since this is a work session, we basically are ask questions, answer questions, and because at the original bill hearing, we did, hear from you. Now, maybe before we do that, Representative Rollins, right? Coming up, and I know that you provided this amendment, and some of the folks did have some questions on the amendment, that maybe we could do that first.
Have you looked at the amendment yet?
Okay.
Yes. Okay. I was asked to put the amendment in by Econ, okay? And I would like to have Mr. Pickens talk about that because he's the expert on it. But this was a request from Econ to put in that amendment,
Okay.
okay?
That's fine. So, please, Mr. Pickett.
So, first and foremost, thank you again for having us here today. Certainly myself and on behalf of Econ and Newport citizens, we appreciate your consideration. And I can assure you, in hearing a few of the questions that came forth when Sarah was presenting, we would not be here unless we had to. So we are all volunteers. Most of us are either business folks or own businesses in town, and we have looked at every possibility that we can in order to meet the financial assurance. So this is certainly not the number one option we had. This is the, oh my goodness, if we don't at least look at this option, we may have to fold up shop, and that landfill may go into the hands of the state, of which the wonderful taxpayers of Newport would have to, or Newport, as well as the state, would have to pay for anyway. So again, what we are trying to do is we are trying to continue on with our steward, or being steward of that landfill, to take that off from the onus of the state to ensure that it continually is maintained in the fashion that it's been maintained. So, this is definitely a fishbowl. So we have gone to someone said something about stakeholders. We have talked with every stakeholder we can. We had a meeting in Newport that included all of our delegates. It included the state. It included the Attorney General's office. It included the Joe Kenny, Councilor Kenny. It included the town. It included a number of folks. So again, this is not something that we have not looked at all possible opportunities for us to basically look for a solution for this. And it was truly at that meeting when we vetted all of our options that we met with, Senator Ward, Representative Rollins, as well as Councilman Kenny, and they said, look, based upon the situation and based upon the midstream change in what happened with a state organization, I think we need to go to the legislature. So again, this was not me saying, oh my God, we got to hit a pot of money. This is our representatives that basically said this is exactly what we're here for. So that is why this bill is here. The first bill was basically a placeholder because we did not have the time and energy that we now have had to work with experts. So we are working closely with DES, and when Sarah indicates that's the case, they have been, but their hands are tied. They have regulations and laws in place that just makes it very difficult for them to do anything to help us and them out. We are also working with Novus Engineering. So Novus is probably one of the premier engineers in the state. And Novus has been on this job since we took it on back in 2006. And then we are also working with council because I am not familiar how to sort of work this scenario. So we are working with a gentleman who is an environmental attorney expert and actually used to sit as a head of the Attorney General's team for the DES. So again, we are working with everyone and anyone and the partners that we think we need to work with to figure this out, and that's why we're here. Everything pointed to you got to at least give this a shot because it fits the criteria that we believe might look for consideration. So the amendment was put forth after having further discussions with all partners because we had some time in order to put that revision together. And that is basically the culmination of the way that all of those parties believe that this could best work. So, and again, whenever you want me to stop and answer questions, I'm happy to, but there's just there's a lot of information that I wish I was here earlier, and unfortunately, I was literally sitting outside and thought you were on the first agenda item. So I only caught the last, but the actual amount in the trust is not 883. So as of the December 1st, 2021 statement from Citizens Bank where the trust is, it is $756,000 and $756,649. However, that's overstated because we have bills outstanding for 5 years from the town that has been supporting our efforts without being able to get the money to pay them. They basically withheld 5 years of invoices because we were not able to get that money released by the DES. So the town, understanding the importance of the landfill, basically gave us an invoice of $172,699. So that money is already spent. That is the work that the town did over the last 5 years to meet all of the criteria necessary from DES. So we have not been able to pay the town because we cannot provide the financial assurance to allow the DES to have us take money out of that account to pay the town. So at this point in time, the town said, you know, we feel we have done what we can. We have done this for 5 years, but we also have to collect this for the taxpayers of Newport. We are no longer going to be able to do this gratis until you figure out what is going on. And again, that is what's pushing a lot of this resolution, is because we right now do not have the monies to pay for the maintenance of a landfill. So if you were to take out the $173,000 from the monies that's in the trust, that basically leaves us with $584,000. So that is the monies that are in the trust. And then we have been working with Novus very diligently on what the annual cost of that landfill will be. So I didn't want to come here without numbers and have you opine over something without knowing exactly what it is that we would need in order to support and meet that financial assurance. So if we were to take a look at all of the annual costs associated, as well as take a piece or part of the capital costs that we would have to do over the next 30 years, we basically would need $820,000. And before I start, DES has not seen these numbers, so just to put that forth, we just finalized these yesterday after a very long meeting to make sure we brought it to you folks. So $820,000. Of that $820,000, there is a 10% contingency, so that is built in for future years should interest rates go awry, or should inflation or interest assumptions sort of not be exactly what we're thinking. That will sort of absorb some of the cushion. So we need $820,000. We now have $534,000. So there is no way at this point in time that we are going to get the okay from DES to allow us to use any of that money to continue managing that landfill. So what we are looking for, because of that midstream change, or as they call it, a clarification, regardless, it has put us in this position, you know, we are unable to provide support in order to manage and monitor that for the folks in Newport, the folks of the state. The monies are just not there. So if we were successful, and if you folks were to consider this to a nonprofit, and I'm not sure, someone had said something about precedent. That is a great question, and the first one that I would ask, and the first one I thought someone would ask before I stepped in here. You know, if there is ever any other nonprofit that took on, for the benefit of a town, the ownership of a landfill without ever earning $1 on that landfill, and if indeed rules were changed such that they had enough prior to, but when the rule changed, they did not any longer have it, I would say that's a good precedent. And if there was another organization that was doing that, that got into this situation, I would hope you would also consider that. So this is not a precedent for the 50 landfills. This is a precedent for a very, very unique situation that I have not had the chance to speak to anyone, professional or not, that has ever seen this happen before. Never. So if we were to put that 500,000, were that to come to us, that 500,000 would basically go towards the requirement of financial assurance. And then also, as you know, we pretty much not only need the financial assurance, but we need the money to actually pay for the expenses. So this is, again, a one-up. We are the only organization that is having to use $820,000 that we just have to amass as a nonprofit and sit aside and never use it. You know, I do not know any organization, nonprofit or not, that has that requirement unless it's restricted, but it's usually restricted for a general purpose at some point, a capital needs project or something. So the onus on us as a one-up is to come up with $820,000 that we just kindly leave in there into perpetuity, and we have to also come up with the expense. So remember, this is only taking care of the financial assurance. So with that $500,000, we still have some left over from that financial assurance package that the DES is only going to be looking for the amount we need for financial assurance, and then we will be able to cover the expenses with the amount that we have left over. But even in that particular case, you know, we will have $464,000 as an organization to go through other means to try to find that $400,000. And again, we just need to get the financial assurance piece done first in order to meet the legislative requirements to at least be able to pay anything. So that's the situation we're in. I apologize, I know you said, but I just wanted to make sure
That's
that
okay.
we had those.
Representative Lynn?
No, can I ask you, you said, as you were making your presentation, that this was the only nonprofit that you were aware of that that undertook something like this for the benefit of the town. And so I guess my question is, if you did this for the benefit of the town and you're now, you know, short on money, why shouldn't it be the town who was the beneficiary that is responsible for coming up with the money as opposed to the state?
So the town manager actually sits on econ, and he used to be the president of the organization, and because all of this basically came to a head, he stepped down. So I am relatively new to the presidency since June, when all of this basically took place, because of a significant conflict of interest, exactly based upon some of those things that you are indicating. So when I ask him that exact same question, he says, look, Mark, we're only one of 27 towns that put trash in that landfill. It's wonderful for us to be able to support you, but we are not going to cover the expense for 26 other towns' trash who put originally $1.1 million in there to cover 30 years. The 27 districts did exactly what they were asked at that time by the DES and by everyone that negotiated. There was $1.1 million put in there to cover it. And then the 27 towns basically said, we're going to do that, and we're also going to give you an extra $200,000 just in case you had to cover any remedial costs for a significant spill or anything that's unexpected. So you're getting $1.3 million in order to do that. So there is an expenses change. We've done everything you've asked us based upon the law, the regulation, the agreement, with the exception of a change in clarification in 2014 that said, nope, it's not 30 anymore. Now you have to have a rolling 30. So trust me, it's an ask. But again, you have to go back to the town and have the town take on a liability, or the town do something on behalf of 27 other towns when they sign that indemnification agreement like every other town in that group.
You ought to follow up then, Tom.
So if I'm understanding, and please understand, sir, I'm not in any way faulting you, in some personal way, or the board, or anything like that. But I guess as I'm trying to understand this, let's suppose that the towns that were involved in this had not been under what DES says was a misunderstanding as to what their requirements were, and that may have been reasonable or unreal. I'm not making any judgment on that. But let's say that the towns had correctly understood that they needed to have a 30-year rolling assurance as opposed to 30 years fixed. It sounds to me like what that would have meant is that the towns all would have known at the beginning and would have had to put up more money. So in a sense, they've gotten the benefit, if you will, of putting up less money in the beginning because they were under this misapprehension. Mm-hmm. And so again, I come back to my question, if that's true, if they got the benefit, so to speak, of putting up less money, so presumably all those 27 towns had that excess money to spend on something else, and now it's come time to pay the piper, so to speak, why shouldn't it be those towns that have to put up the extra money as opposed to the state?
And that is a great point, and one that I would love nothing more to go to the towns and just have them open up their coffers and say, Mark, regardless of anything that we signed way back when, we feel for your position, and we are just going to cover your expenses until perpetuity at whatever expenses they will be. And I don't mean to be facetious, but if indeed they knew it was a rolling 30, every single time that we would have to present this to the DES on a 3-year period for the next 30 years, it wouldn't have been written as a one-time amount for 30 years, and there certainly wouldn't be an indemnification agreement that said this is subject to change in rules, subject to change in regulation, and don't come to us if expenses go up. So that wouldn't have been the negotiating piece for us. It would have been every 3 years, if these expenses go up, we are going to do financial assurance for the next 30, and if we don't have enough, we are going to divvy it up amongst all you towns. That is exactly the way it would have been written if they would have known, or we would have known, it was a rolling 30 and not a fixed 30. So if we were to go back, that's exactly how it should have been done, but you only have the information. And again, all this was signed off by the commissioner at that point in time. I mean, the commissioner is the one that was releasing the funds from the trust, and in his letters, he basically said, I, as a commissioner, allow you to take this out because there's enough to cover the remaining 15 years of this agreement. I mean, it's not unclear. It is no way, I know they say it's a clarification. It was not unclear. Not unclear at all. I can show you all of those letters where they say, you're good to go for the remaining. And then all of a sudden, the next one comes in and says, just kidding, now we need 30. So.
And that occurred in 2016, is that correct?
The actual law change, I think, was 2014.
No, that wasn't my question. When did they stop allowing you to?
We were unable to provide financial assurance in 16.
Okay, so that was.
Correct.
The year.
So the last 5 years, again, that's the 5 years that the town has been covering our expenses, awaiting, hopefully, a resolution. And again, we've tried and had discussions with the DES, and I do believe their hands are tied because their regulation says you need a rolling 30-year financial assurance. And trust me, I think they are willing, and I don't mean to speak on behalf, I think they would be willing to do anything reasonable within their control. I mean, they do not want to take this back. I mean, they really, really do not want to take this landfill back, and that's right from the commissioner's mouth.
Yeah. Representative Bucco, you had a question?
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. No, there was just one other thing that I wanted to add is that the state operates on a 2-year budget, and this is the off year. And generally, when we get special bills like this, when we usually don't fund them in the second year until we come around and put another budget together.
So a couple things on that. The premise of us ever having to use the state's money is nearly statistically nil, right? Because the monies that are in that account can never be used, and the DES controls it, and the DES will not allow us, and I can assure you that over the last 5 years, they're pretty good at that, will not allow us to take money out if we don't have enough to preserve that financial assurance, which is the state's money. So the way that we look at it, it is a placeholder in order for us to meet financial assurance, but monies that we're never going to use. So the only way that we ever use that money is if we can't afford the annual expenses and the state takes it back. But the way the bill's written is if there is any, well, first of all, the good news, if this closes, and Sarah indicated a number of these close. So if this closes within the next 15 years, I mean, this is probably one of the strongest and best managed, maintained lined landfills in the state. So if it does reach a closure, 500,000 goes right back to the state. So the monies are being expended. And I know that doesn't answer your question, but I guess the timing isn't as critical if we knew it was coming, and that could be one of the negotiations with DES, right? So they don't need it today. And I don't mean to speak on behalf of the DES, and Sarah can certainly come up and indicate if I'm indicating something wrong, but I'm not sure that we need it today. We just need to show that we're going to have it. So even if it was to come in at another period of time, you know, that is something that we would go back to the DES and say, you know, pretty much a guarantee, as far as guarantees can go. So, but we would prefer it because it's cleaner, but if that is an impossibility, you know, we could probably work around timing.
Representative Heath?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is very confusing. How do you raise the funds for the yearly maintenance? Right now, you already owe Newport for 5 years. So, number one, how are you going to get that money? How are you going to continue to pay for the maintenance? Now, you're asking for this $500,000. Another question is, what's your succession plan? I mean, you have this board. Are you going to be there forever? This is a problem with lots of unanswered questions that just bothers me greatly.
Great question, and the first one I can answer a lot easier than the second, because I can only speak for myself being on there, and I don't foresee myself. I mean, I've been on there for 20 years, and if I was to give you sort of the membership, if anyone was going to jump, they would have jumped over the last 6 months, right? Because right now we spend 100% of our time having nothing to do with economic development in town, all having to do with run an ash landfill. So if anyone was going to jump, I assure you, even me, we would have jumped and we would have handed the keys over to DES, because that's the easy answer, right? That's the real easy answer as a volunteer, is why am I going to spend 40 hours a week doing something that takes me away from my day job? So I think folks will definitely be around, but I cannot guarantee. The organization has been in existence since the early 90s, through thick and thin, and many of us are still there. So all I can give you is as much comfort level as that gives you. The second one with the numbers, so the way that the numbers pan out, 156,000 in that account. If we were to get another $500,000, we would have appropriate financial assurance to take monies in order to pay the town 172. So after we take the monies that we have now, minus the 172, plus the 500, that would, at the end of the day, leave us with about 464,000 in our coffers, while still having financial assurance at 820 to cover expenses. And the way that the expenses work is the annual expenses only run around, the annual testing expenses only run around 17 or 18,000 a year. Where the other expenses come in is more capital replacement. So we have to replace a leachate tank at 50 grand, or we have to replace, those are not going to happen every year. And those aren't even going to happen within probably the next 10 years. So that 464,000, basically over 30 years, provides enough monies for us to cover those expenses. And we would reserve that, earmark it, keep it. And then the other thing we've been able to do, and again, we're looking at every possibility. So also on that property is a garage. So we have negotiated with the town of Newport to rent the garage for some of their equipment for $5,000 a year. And then the police department has a shooting range in which they use to train their staff, and that as well would give a $5,000 annual. So we have recurring revenue of $10,000 on top of that $26,000, which over time, we are just hopeful we would always have enough to cover those definitely annual expenses, but the capital expenses as well. At least that gets us, I hope, 15, 20 years, and that's a long time for us to figure out additional income in order to keep this going. Right now, we don't have time. I mean, we're right now under the gun of the DES with 90 days to come up with financial assurance, not 15 years. So,
All right, thank you, sir.
that helps.
Representative Murray, you had a question? Oh, no, okay. Okay, Representative Petrie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. Where does that 26,000, where does that come from? Your revenue?
So it would come from the excess monies that we would have when we take the amount that we currently have in the financial assurance, plus the $500,000, were we to get your consideration. We only need to keep 820 in that account. So if you basically take the total amount we have now, less the 120, that is the amount of monies that we would have in our own coffers to cover the expense.
Follow-up. So you're spending at least 17 plus incidentals. You don't have, in other words, you're not keeping to build that or maintain your expenses. Where's that excess come from?
Again, I have a spreadsheet, but I don't want to bore you with the numbers because we also haven't shared these with the DES. So we have, and I apologize, I'm not explaining this well. So we have two different components, right? We have the financial assurance, which is $820,000. Right now, we have minus the $172,000 due to the town of Newport. We have $584,000. So that's the monies we have now. The other part or piece of this, and maybe this is where the numbers don't add up for you folks, understandably, is we have that additional $200,000 that we have never spent. So we have $200,000 that was also provided to us at the time that we took over the landfill. So we have that $200,000. So right now we have $784,000 right now to basically cover $820 for the financial assurance, and then presumably $820 for 30 years. So if we were to get the $500,000 on top of the 784, again, that is what would allow us the monies above and beyond the financial assurance we needed to cover those expenses for a significant period of time, which will be at least half of it or close to half of it on an annual basis will come from recurring revenue from the town's rental of $10,000.
Follow-up. So you're getting a revenue of 10,000 possibly, so the 26 is what? That's not every year that you have a revenue of 26.
Nope, not a revenue, but we would deplete from the reserve that we have based upon taking all those monies together and having some excess over and above the financial assurance that we can't use. We will still have a bucket of monies that we will deplete over time in order to cover those expenses until we figure out how to not only get 10,000, but we figure out a stream of income or an income source to get us the full amount.
Right, now, is that 200,000, is that liquid?
Yes.
So, okay, so you do have,
Yes.
you do
Oh,
have
yeah.
a backup.
So we put that basically in a reserve account the day that we did this deal, and it's still sitting in that account because that was part of that indemnification that we needed that $200,000. But again, we are hopeful, and we have not spoken with the DES, so I'm somewhat hesitant, but there is no restrictions that we can't use that 200,000 towards the financial assurance piece. So if it's sitting there and not being used anyway, it would be nice to have it sitting there and not being used anyway, but help to go towards the financial assurance.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Turcott?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Pitkin. A few questions. The first one, and I think you said you weren't the president at the time, so you may not know the answer to this. This is more of a philosophical one, and then I have some numerical ones for you. But why was the decision initially made by this nonprofit to take over a landfill? The numbers we heard were it's the only one out of 400 in the state. What was the thought process behind that?
So at that point in time, the landfill was closed, and there was 27 towns that were trying to manage this one particular piece. And from what I'm told, it was just a logistical and administrative nightmare. And one of the solutions was always to open up the remaining 2 cells. So it's a 4-cell ash landfill, only 2 cells were used. By opening up those 2 cells, I was also told that we would get incinerated ash, not just from folks in New Hampshire, but we would be pulling in incinerated ash from all over New England. So literally Newport would have become the trash town. So we would have had trash trucks coming in daily, and again, just everything else that goes along with that type of operation. So at that point in time, the president of Econ also happened to be the town manager. So again, you can see where conflicts, but it really wasn't a conflict because we worked so close together, but it was at that point in time when they all negotiated and said, okay, how can we do this to preserve that from never being open again, to have it go under a conservation easement for the benefit, and it's right on the Claremont line, so I would say Claremont as well, but for the benefit of Newport, while making sure that Econ collects enough money so it is not harmed financially over that 30-year period. So minds, I guess, much greater than mine got together, and there were attorneys that were on both sides, so they come up with this plan that was supported by the selectmen in order to preserve Newport as not being the dump town. The land is now in conservation based upon that process, and then they worked with the DES because we are the first nonprofit not only to do it, we are the first one that ever received a modified permit for a closure as being someone that is not affiliated with the refuge business to manage. So again, we had to go through significant hoops, I believe, at that point in time, because this was something new for the DES. They said, oh my God. But again, it was proven to the DES that this process and the support mechanism of that monies would make it plausible. So if you were to ask me, would I do that today? Absolutely not. I mean, I'm a banker. I understand liability issues. I understand hazardous materials, right? We stay away from them. But I can't speak for, the board at that time, or at least those that put it together. But I can tell you that at the time, it appeared to be a very good solution to a very difficult problem with 27 towns.
Thank you. You mentioned the 90-day period that the DES has given you. When does that expire?
We're getting calls daily. And again, right, well, maybe over the last couple days. So I think it might have already expired, Sarah. Do you know? So I think it's probably expired.
Expired already. Okay. You talked about possibilities if you couldn't come up with the numbers or whatever. In your opinion, what would happen to the, first of all, I guess, what would happen if your numbers, you can't meet your numbers? What do you presume what will happen and when? And the second part of that is the money that's currently held, whatever, we've gone over a bunch of numbers, whatever numbers remain, what would happen to that current amount of money?
So this is what I'm told. And again, I don't mean to speak on their behalf, but again, I've been part and parcel of conversations. So the monies in financial assurance are basically there to cover the expense should one of these individuals that operate these become insolvent. And then it goes back to the state, and then the state presumably has that security in order to continue to manage it in the manner and fashion that it was. So any monies that we have in that trust fund would go back to the state. So the other alternative now is the state could definitely take that back with $584,000 after paying the town. But again, there's resources involved. I mean,
I understand.
they find it's less cheaper and much more efficient for us to operate it than if they operated it, I believe.
Totally understand, and thank you for the answer. I think I had one more. You mentioned, I guess this is in a conservation easement now?
Yes.
It's probably silly. I guess if I was a conservation group, I probably wouldn't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. But has any conservation groups been approached on this?
So the only piece that's in conservation is the actual landfill itself. So we have approximately another 8 acres that is not necessary to be in that conservation area, or the area surrounding the landfill that is not required, again, to be monitored and managed, and that is held by the town. So the only one presumably that was, yeah, the town as part of that holds the conservation
So there's
easement.
8 acres that's not in it, and then what's the acreage of the total? Just curious, it's not important.
Sadly enough, I don't know. I know the 8
That's fine.
acres because, again, that was one of the options. Try to rent it, try to lease it, try to sell it, or even have the DES take a mortgage on it. I mean, we've tried everything we can. But again, if it's not liquid, it's very difficult for them to, if it's not liquid or if it's not able to be raised through tax assessment means. I would say maybe it's an additional 6. I don't know.
Thank you. Will we get a chance to speak with Sarah again?
Of course.
Thank you.
So can I,
Representative Lynn, sorry.
may I ask, so if the, and this is, maybe in some sense is a rhetorical question, but I think your input would be important. If, as you said before, if you have evidence that in the past, before there was this clarification, DES had basically said, you can spend the money that you've proposed to spend and whatever, because you have enough to, to guarantee this for 15 years. Why wouldn't it be an appropriate resolution of this matter for DES, basically because of its sort of reinterpretation? Why isn't it an appropriate resolution for your group to say to DES, look, we relied on you, and now we don't have a sufficient amount of money. That's your problem. You're going to have to take the risk of having a less of a bond, if you will, to guarantee the assurance of this than you might prefer, but that's kind of the way it is. And we're not, I mean, why wouldn't that, as opposed to the state appropriating $500,000, be an appropriate resolution?
So I was basically told, I believe, and again, Sarah can absolutely positively give her opinion on this. So a couple things happened. If indeed the requirement was still only 15 years and we could use the monies in order to cover the expenses for 15 years, that might be a viable solution. Not one that they would probably accept, but for us, a viable solution. But now what happens is we not only have to have the monies for 15 years, but we have to be able to pay for them extraneous to that amount. So even if we did that, they'd say, or potentially could say, fine, leave the 15 years in there, but now you still have to pay for it for the next 30. So we still don't have the ongoing operation expenses because they still won't allow us to touch that, even if they say that amount's enough. However, I believe that in order, and again, I'm speaking out of turn, but you wanted my opinion, it's just that, in order for them to circumvent the actual regulation, it would require some sort of carve-out from a body that is supported by you folks. So like a legislative carve-out that said, we know you require 30. We know that's the law, but we are going to allow a carve-out for econ. And again, I am speaking well out of turn. And I think Sarah said appropriately that they have a regulation. And again, they say, we are sorry, we're so sorry, but, you know, we have looked at everything we can do. And when we got the letter of administrative order, it just basically said, our hands are tied, you have to come up with a 30-year. So that's a great question. I think we would be willing to work with something like that, but I don't think it solves the problem of going forward and actually being able to pay for those expenses. That would solve for the 15-year financial assurance, but we still would have to pay for the expenses annually, if that makes sense.
So can I just, am I understanding then from the very beginning of this, you were paying for sort of ongoing expenses out of the original monies that were put up? Is that correct? And that with the at least tacit approval of DES at least up until 2016?
Yes, that's correct. So the monies that paid were what was approved by the commissioner to take out of that financial assurance trust fund to pay the ongoing expenses. And then we were told we can't do that anymore. So not only do we need more on the financial assurance side, but now we have to cover the expenses. So again, it is a double whammy. It wasn't just a single whammy, it was a double whammy where we have to come up now with, you know, over $1 million in total, whereas before we didn't need anything, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Representative Murray.
Thank you. Now I have two questions. I think Ms. Kearns made a comment that a new analysis is being done. If you can speak to that, is that possibly that's going to be an optimistic analysis from your point of view? And secondly, is there a way of having a discussion that perhaps this is working the way it's supposed to? As I understand trusts and endowments, it's still frustrating to me in some situations where so much money is tied up that can't be used. And that this is maybe a situation where this fund is being used appropriately. I think to Representative Lynn's point that, yes, you don't have this, and regardless of misunderstanding or rules change, whatever, now it's an appropriate use of this money. Can you sort of speak to that as a potential argument? Thank you.
Sure. Again, great questions. I appreciate it. So we indeed are working on an analysis, and that's sort of what we finished up yesterday. So as I said, everyone has been supportive and stakeholders. We've gone to Novus. Novus has given us, and I probably should be announcing this, but a significant discount on what they're doing for us because they understand our plight. They don't have to. They just truly, truly want to do what they can. So they do our annual testing, our monitoring, and our reporting to the state. And that makes us feel good because the state always tells us again that the process and the monitoring and the managing is one of the best. So they have no issue with what we do or how we do it, certainly not Novus. So they have cut down their expenses. There were a lot of things where they were subcontracting out a number of things that we pay them to do. So what they did was they put us in contact with the actual contractors. So now that we are able to contract with those folks that literally go and take the testing and so on and so forth. So we saved a significant amount on that end as well. I've spoken to the folks that transport the leachate. They're helping us out. And even the guy that does the mowing. So trust me, I've gone to them and I said, we have got to get this thing down to as thin a margin as possible because that's what determines that financial assurance amount is you take the annual amount, you multiply it times 30. So that has been basically cut down to its bare bones. The one piece that is very difficult to cut down is capital expenditures. So that's the part or piece that you really can't cut down. The cost of replacing a leachate tank is $50,000 no matter how you look at it. The cost of replacing a monitoring well is $3,000 no matter how you look at it. So it is those capital expenses that we always have to make sure that we have enough to cover. Those are the parts or pieces that sort of contribute a significant amount to that financial assurance pot. So this 820 that we're working on, again, a 10% contingency. So without the contingency, you know, we basically would need approximately $760,000 without the contingency. And then your other something, and maybe I shouldn't rephrase, it had something to
But that
do with the amount.
possibly this mechanism is working as it's supposed to work, in that you can't fulfill the obligations regardless of the reason behind it. And that this money, in a trust fund has been set aside for this type of a situation. And that this is actually working appropriately, and DES should be using this money because regardless of the situation, you can't fulfill your obligations.
And again, I'd love to have all you guys in my discussions with the DES. So again, I think where their hands are tied is that the regulation specifically states, regardless, that they need a financial assurance for 30 years. And if they are to make a departure, someone had said something about precedent, that may set one of the biggest precedents is if you are making a departure from the DES rules, regardless of what happened prior to, and then someone else comes in and says, wait a minute, you made us put an extra amount or to cover an extra amount. So again, Sarah is the person to answer that, but I would say that would work.
To that
Go ahead.
point, I understand what you're saying, thank you, around, the 30 years and their regulations. But if you just locked your doors and said, we're done, then this money that's in the trust fund is what DES would have to use in order to continue the work. I
Oh,
guess is my
that's the
point.
option, and they know that that's a viable option. And again, if I didn't have the passion to do what I'm doing here, I don't know who else on that group would literally say, I'm going to leave my job for hours on end and talk to everyone possible to get this thing fixed. Again, this is saving the state taxpayers, well, maybe the same amount of money, but we're taking on the work, and so this is actually a different way to get to the same result that may be a better way if we're thinking about taxpayers' money, which I know that's your job, and I appreciate that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, and again, it's unfortunately not a threat because none of us are able to, with day jobs, run an ash landfill and go out and try to figure out somehow, some way, a mechanism to create an income stream to maintain an ash landfill when we're an economic development organization. We want to go out, we want to improve Newport and Sullivan County. I mean, that is our mission. Our mission nowhere says, we will maintain an ash landfill. But you're absolutely right. That is an argument that I've used
Okay.
a few times.
Sarah, could you rejoin us? And actually, Mr. Pitkin, it might be helpful if you could sit up here at this chair.
Of course.
And that way, and I probably should have had, if that's okay with her, I don't
Sure
know.
No problem.
I have to say, again, Sarah and the DES has been very good, very congenial, but I think their hands are tied.
Okay, somebody had, Representative Turcott, did you have some questions for DES? Okay. Okay, so Representative Lynn will bail you out, okay?
Ms. Kern, I wonder if I could ask you, I understand what the regulations say, and I assume you've interpreted them correctly and all of that, but doesn't DES exercise in this situation just like it does in a whole bunch of other, you have, in other words, the law doesn't say you will take it over. Or, I mean, don't you have sort of, for lack of a better term, prosecutorial discretion to decide, well, sure, we could take over this landfill because there's not enough of a bond, so to speak, but we're going to decide in the exercise of our discretion not to do so, just like, in a criminal case, somebody may have committed a burglary, but the county attorney doesn't have to, or the attorney general doesn't have to prosecute. They can say, we've decided for other reasons we're not going to.
DES does have enforcement discretion. And what DES needs to do is weigh many factors, including the liability that is presented for future generations when a landfill does not have proper financial assurance. I asked my staff, 400 closed landfills, if many of them did not have enough financial assurance, and they all, their permittees became insolvent, what would that burden be? And it's hundreds of millions of dollars on the state. So we need to keep that in mind.
Sure, I understand, but if I'm understanding, I'm sorry, can I have a follow? If I'm understanding correctly, there isn't, as far as we know, there isn't another situation like this, and it appears, and you correct me if I'm wrong, it appears that the operators of this landfill in question, there's no, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's no claim that they operated in bad faith or that they took, that somebody took some of the money and went to Aruba or anything like that. As far as we know, they've done what they're supposed to have done.
Yeah, I want to be clear that Econ has been very good stewards of the environment with this landfill.
Right. So, in those wouldn't that be a pretty good reason to say, of all the landfills and all the operators of landfills in the state, that we might want to go after, this is probably not the one we want to do that for. And even though we don't have as much of a security as we'd like, they seem to be doing what they're supposed to be doing. If we take it over, we're gonna have to pay the money that's not there in case something does go wrong. So far, it hasn't gone wrong. So why not try to fix a problem that's not broken, at least not now?
We absolutely don't want to take over this landfill, call financial assurance on the landfill. That's why we're working with Econ. I think your question may get at the problem that there needs to be money for annual maintenance and monitoring, as well as the financial assurance. We can't, our hands are tied as far as the rules and regulations go. We can't authorize more disbursements from the trust fund, and that's how we find ourselves in this situation.
Thank you.
Are you ready now?
Yes, Madam Chair, I am ready.
Okay, good.
Is the DES prepared to take this over if it needed to, and at what point would you?
If DES needed to, we have experience with another landfill in the state calling financial assurance on the landfill. That other landfill has nearly spent down its financial assurance account to zero. So in coming years, we will be needing to figure out how to fund additional maintenance and monitoring at that landfill. But we have experience doing that sort of thing.
You do? Okay. The 2014 rule change, what was the impetus behind that?
Well, I was in a different part of DES in 2014.
I figured you might be, but I thought you might know the answer.
That rule change included this provision about financial assurance, clarifying it, as well as some other things. But my understanding is the reason the 30-year rolling requirement was clarified in 2014 is because staff had noticed that there was confusion among the regulated entities about it.
Was the confusion noted in particularly on the Econ situation? Or was it something else?
That's not something that I have heard, so I couldn't comment on that.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Petrie?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for taking my question. Now, did you say Collins? He was answering his question. Is that the Collins and Aikman landfill in Farmington?
No.
There's a trust there, I know, and I was, what they had for a reserve in that for that landfill, and I know it's maintained by an outside entity because for the reason of taxation, because now the town of Farmington can recoup the taxes on the property because it's a private entity.
The landfill I'm thinking of is in the northern part of the state and has no responsible party doing any work on it. So, well, it has the state
So-
hiring a contractor to do it.
So, follow up, how does the Collins and Aikman in Farmington, how do they maintain their monitoring and whatever?
I'm sorry, I don't have information on Collins and Aikman here with me today.
Because that is a private concern that went bankrupt. And I'm pretty sure that DES does not, they're overseers, but they don't take an active role in,
That makes
Taken
sense
care of.
to me, since it's not one that's been brought to my attention as one where we do take an active part.
very good, thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Yes. Go ahead,
Thank you.
Representative Murray.
Again, apropos following up on Representative Lynn, is the problem here the regulations and not anything that Econ is doing? And what I don't understand is there a regulation change that should be affected in order to allow you to work with Econ? I'm baffled as to the range of what DES can do and what they can't do. It seems to me that working with them should well be within your purview and your powers. So where are these rules that don't allow you to work with them in this way? And is that basically the problem?
We can work with them and problem solve within the requirements of the solid waste rules and the statute 149M. I don't have specific citations for you here, right here at this moment. As far as a rule change, that's not something DES is pursuing. If someone was to pursue a rule or statute change, they would want to evaluate the impact on the other 400 closed landfills and how that would affect the state and the taxpayers.
Representative Turcott.
Could somebody provide me the list, or us maybe with the list of the 27 towns who were originally involved, or point me to a website or something, or where I could just see what those towns are?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
We could do that.
Yeah, send that to Janet, if you would. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, in follow-up to I think I share some of the same kind of concerns that Representative Murray shares, and that is this. Suppose that you say that, the rules don't allow you to allow the landfill operators to draw any further money out to pay for ongoing operating expenses from. But let's suppose, am I understanding correctly, that if the state decided that it was going to take over this landfill, you would succeed to the trust? Is that correct? Whatever the balance is left in that, you would be entitled to take that over and have that as an asset from which, that's the whole purpose of having that, right?
That is the purpose
Right.
of the trust.
So let's suppose that you did that. Could you then use money in that trust to pay for operating expenses?
To pay for the maintenance and monitoring, yes. if we
So,
were to.
okay, so, this seems kind of circular. If you can do that, why couldn't you decide, just as a discretionary matter, to just say, well, if we take this over, we're going to spend the trust money for ongoing maintenance. The people that are operating it now are doing a pretty good job of that. Why don't we just let them do that, even though it does reduce the trust amount, because we would be reducing the trust amount anyway if we took it over?
Because it's two separate portions of the rules, and we have a solvent permittee in this case, so the rules don't allow it. And we take very seriously not exceeding the authority that's given to us by statute and rule.
So if we amended this bill to say, the $200 million, whatever the figure was. No. How much is currently in your set aside? 200,000?
500.
No.
In our set aside. Oh,
Yeah.
200,000?
Right.
Yes.
And that's earning interest? or something.
Something.
It's earning something, okay?
Something.
It's, yeah, it's kind of probably like my money market or something or other, but okay. So we could amend the bill to say that as far as this landfill is concerned, 200,000 in this, whatever it is, meets the requirement for the, whatever it was called, the assurance fund, and just leave it at that. I mean, and that way, that covers DES. It covers econ, and we don't have to spend $500,000. I mean, I'm just making, I'm like hearing this really, really circular argument that's going around,
So,
and I'm having some problems. Representative Heath, please.
Instead of doing that, would it be possible to grant DES waiver authority and be very specific in relation to the terms of that waiver? And that would allow them to go forward. And then again, quite frankly, I think we may have maybe 30 years from now, the legislators will be hearing the same thing. I don't know. Because, I mean, this has the potential for some real problems. But if DES had that waiver authority, there might be other circumstances where they need to do certain things like this. It seems like the rules are awfully rigid.
Well, we can't waiver the rules, as you know. That's not our purview. Jalkar has approved the rules, and probably there is nothing in legislation that says other than DES will make rules. So all that we can, I think, all that we can do is say, this works. I mean, obviously, any rule that we have can be waived. However, as I'm listening to the testimony, DES is not at this point willing to waive that rule. I mean, that's what I'm hearing. And so all that we can do in legislation is say what they have meets the requirements and that they can spend money out of the remaining. I mean, that appears to be, to me anyhow, our option. Now,
May I just make a comment on that?
Sure.
I think your analysis is exactly correct, but I think, I guess from my perspective, what I would say is if we reject this legislation, then DES will be in a different position, and they will have to decide whether they want to take over this landfill or not, I think.
no, excuse me. Let's go ahead, Mark. Go ahead and tell us what you wanted to say.
So just getting back to the 200,000, so there's other parts and pieces that make it very difficult to just make certain assumptions with that money and what it can be used for. So that was set aside as part of the purchase and sale and indemnification agreements, that it only has a specific purpose. And I am told by our attorney that we would be in trouble by the charitable division if we start taking money and use it for unintended purposes, and that might prevent or present some personal liabilities. So I don't know if we would be able to amend the amendment the only way.
Wait, I'm not looking for that money to go anyplace other than to be targeted as your amount of money if after another 15 years the landfill falls apart. I mean, I'm not.
Yep, so that's our thought process with DES, is to have them allow it, but the only way I think that would happen is if they were to give us some sort of waiver that if we were ever called on the 27 towns to use the 200, that they would release that from the financial assurance mechanism, because if it's part of the financial assurance mechanism, we have to wait for them to allow us to spend it. And if it is restricted from what its current use was, then we cannot put it there. So we still haven't had that negotiation with DES. But we cannot just arbitrarily put that in, and I'm not sure if this group can, to be honest, just because it's got to be the DES that says, yes, we know you're using financial assurance, but here's the thing, the only time that 200,000.
We've got to get out of this thought process, okay? The thought process is, number one, I'm not going to give you $500,000, okay? And I don't think there's anyone else in this room that is willing to do that. If there is, speak up. But I haven't heard from the questions that that is even a possibility. So what I'm trying to do, I think, and what we're all trying to do, is to somehow or other help the landfill continue to operate as they have been, and agreeing that all they have to, the money that they have put aside, the $200,000, covers whatever assurances that DES needs. That's where I'm coming from. Representative Turcott, I'm sorry, I'm like crazy.
One statement, one question. Y'all are in a hell of a predicament.
Yeah, absolutely.
The question for Sarah, if you could do me a favor, in addition to the 27 towns, could you confirm one way or another that the rule change that was done in, this says 2013, but I guess it went into effect 2014, that it in fact was not done specifically for this econ issue?
I will do my best. However, our staff at all levels of DES has turned over since then. And if there's not a note in a file, there will be no one to ask.
I would ask that you do your ultimate best to see if we can figure that out. Thank you.
Mick, do they keep detailed records of what goes on in jail car, like, I mean?
Yeah, we have transcripts of
Yep.
those meetings, so we can go back and review the court reporting and see if there was any discussion relative to Representative Turcott's question, whether it came up at jail car anyways.
Yeah. Okay. So is that something you can easily find, or is that a hard?
No, our office maintains those transcripts, so we've got
Okay.
those, so I just need to find the right meeting and look.
Okay, okay. So,
May I ask just one follow-up clarification, because now I understand what you're saying, and I very much appreciate it. So you were saying that there's somehow, some way, if we put an amendment that just asked, is it an act of the legislator that will say, DES, you will accept this 200,000 as the obligation, and they need to follow? Again, I'm very
Yes.
green. Okay, I get it. I was totally totally misunderstood, but now I get it.
okay. Representative Turcott.
Just thought of another one. On this rule change, were there any other landfills, trusts that were affected as econ has been affected by the rule change? And if you don't know the answer, if you could find out.
I want to be sure that I understand your question. Affected in that.
Financially, in other words, when the rule change went into effect, were there others that were short of money that they had to then pony up to get back to the 30-year rolling versus fixed?
Got it, thank you, yes.
Representative Bucco, did you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This sounds like this is a notwithstanding and then whatever you want to put in there about the 200. Because it's a special bill that's coming in the second year, and we're not going to get it through anyway, even if we wanted to. Thank you.
I agree. Representative Murray.
Thank you. Apropos Representative Turcott and the question of who else would have been affected, there's a uniqueness here in that if another landfill might have been affected, they could rely on their tax base, or they could rely on their community, the township or whatever municipality for that taxes, and they don't have that option. So I think to be clear with his question, and looking at who was affected, the circumstances of how they could acquire money to meet the financial assurance is important, because the municipality would be able to do this where Econ is clearly in a position where they can't. So does that?
Yes, I'm thinking it would be helpful if there are other landfills that were affected, if there was a list and it indicated whether it was a public or private entity and had the name of the permittee.
That would be great. Okay. Are there any further questions?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks again, Sarah, for taking my question. Is this okay, I understand it's a lined landfill. It's probably properly capped. What are the tests showing coming from this landfill? I mean, are they pretty much petered out as far as, VOCs and whatever?
I'm thinking that Mark may have that information more closely at the front of his mind.
So, again, I'm probably speaking way out of my subject matter, but I do know that over time, the leachate itself has reduced substantially. And the only way that that 200,000 can be used for catastrophic that we were talking about was if we had like 40,000 gallons a year. Right now, we're doing like 5,000 every 2 years. So we are trending with all of the metrics in a positive way. The only parts and pieces we don't know, again, not to be specific, but there's some new testing with PFAS that we still do not know. And again, I don't want to speak out of turn, but the answer is it's trending very positively.
Right, and have you been approached by these solar companies to put a solar farm? I know our town, that's what they do. And a source of revenue, which would probably help in your situation, and it's quite 8 acres is a pretty good piece of land.
So we did go down that path as one of our alternatives, and unfortunately where it's located is right between Newport and Claremont, and it does not have three-phase power. And the cost of three-phase power was going to be $1.5 million. So the cost to get us power in order to do it made it not viable. But that's a great solution, and that was one of our first thought processes, but we just can't get there.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Obviously, we still have a lot more thinking to do on this. So I will schedule another work session sometime shortly. I think we have until March 10th, but it'll be long before that because DES owes us some things, okay? And we need to try to figure out, what we're going to do. Am I wrong to suggest that there's anyone here that is willing to provide 500,000? Okay, so that's where we're, okay, so that's where we're at. So I guess that the real thing is that we need to try to figure out if there's a way we can make what they have work. And it may not be the best solution but it is a better solution than econ going belly up. And I mean, I do know that the Economic Council there, as Mr. Lucas explained, is trying to bring the town back, Newport back, to, to give them a sense of positivity. And I think that's occurring outside of this issue. And so, we just need to try to figure out a way to solve this. So I will, I'll schedule this probably someday. We still don't know when we're going to have session, okay, which is kind of one of those, unless Len knows, I don't know that we know.
I'm not aware if it's actually been publicly announced. I am aware, but at this point, since it hasn't come from the Speaker's office, I'll refrain.
Okay, I know that we had talked about it being the week of the 14th. And so, we'll see. I'll wait for that. But, because it'll either be the week of the 14th or the following week. So. Okay, yes.
Just one final point. I think you're correct about the committee going down the road of the 500,000. My major concern, I think it's Representative Lenz has the same concern, is if we can find a solution that it cannot be on a. I hate setting precedents. I hate doing one-offs for this situation, because there'll always be a next situation when we do it. So if we could just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
And
I should have banged my gavel.
I understand completely your desire to find, I mean, it seems to me this is a situation where everybody's kind of operating in good faith, that, it's trying to do the right thing. I completely understand that. And I understand the desire, for a solution. Could I just suggest, though, that it may be that this is not something that's appropriate for a legislative solution? In other words, if we were to do something like, say, create a carve-out for this situation and pass a special law dealing with this situation, I would be really concerned about the precedent we would be establishing, as opposed to basically leaving, saying, this was I completely understand the parties acted in very good faith, trying to say, well, if the legislature would appropriate this money, this would be a solution to our problem. But if the legislature says, no, we're not going to, now the ball's back in your court, you collectively. And my sense is that that's really where it should be, and that DES will have to decide, is this important enough? Are we worried enough that we want to take over this landfill and stop what seems to be a pretty good operation, even though they don't have all the assurances they should have? Or are we willing to say, okay, we're going to sort of waive our rules? Because if they decide to waive their rules, the town certainly, I mean, the landfill operators aren't going to object to that. And I don't think anybody else has standing to object. So they can do this, and it's really sort of out of our hands, and kind of my sense is that's where it should be, is out of our hands.
I don't disagree, but we heard what they said. Our rules are hard and fast. That's what they said. So maybe they'll change their mind. Okay. Thank you all. I'm going to bang the gavel. Thank you all very much.
Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
For coming today.